Welcome in. It is the Everything Guide to Sports Betting here on VSiN, the Sports Betting Network. I'm Jonathan Von Tobel filling in for Patrick Maher. And guess what today is? Josh Applebaum alongside esports. Josh, go.
JBT, it's great to be with you. Just kidding. Yeah, we're doing baseball, right?
I thought we were doing Call of Duty League. I was watching like all weekend. This is not what we're doing today?
This is not what we're doing today. No, we're doing baseball. Yeah. Hey, do you want to keep going with this or just?
Yeah, go ahead, man. It's fun. So let's get into this. Sports Betting 101. Obviously, today is baseball. How to make advantage bets based on team schedules. You wrote about this. We'll start with this today. Walk us through your article. You had it up on vsin.com.
Yeah, so JBT, big episode today on the Everything Guide to Sports Betting. We're talking about baseball, which is one of my favorite sports to bet on overall, and we're going to talk about how basically the basics, the bet types you want to focus on, individual matchups, weighing pitcher matchups. We have some great interviews today. We have Andy Iskoe, professional sports bettor. We also have one of the sharpest guys at Fangraphs. We have Craig Edwards today, so we're going to pick their brain. Basically, handicapping games, stat categories to lean on and focus on. But before we get into the basics of sports betting when it comes to baseball, we got to remember that scheduling has a huge impact not only on baseball but on all sports that you bet on. So just a couple things to keep in mind. When you're, no matter what the sport is, if you're just forgetting about tomorrow, unaware of tomorrow but also unaware of yesterday, and you're just taking that game that day as it is, you can really be hurting yourself overall, because scheduling can play a big role. And a lot of these scheduling spots, whether a team is on short rest or extra rest, or it's a back-to-back, or it's a bye week, whatever it may be, the odds makers will take this into account and they'll set the line based on this information. However, as a sports bettor, you always want to be aware of and ask yourself, okay, how is each team, coming into this game? How are they feeling? How are they doing? When was the last time they played? Because a lot of this information is really, really important to you, and you want to be aware of this when you're going into it. So, number one, when you're looking at NFL favorites, for example, we always look at the bye week. We circle those bye weeks, teams coming off a bye for every single year. Because why is it so important? Because teams coming off a bye, favorites do very, very well historically. Since 2003, according to BetLab Sports, favorites are 59% covering the number. I got to remember, 52.38%, you're breaking even with minus 110 juice. So 59% is very, very good. You'll get Thursday night favorites in the NFL. 57.7% against the spread since 2003. Why is that important? Short week really benefits a team who has the superior coaching and really can get their players up, especially if they don't have to travel as well. Also today, we're talking baseball, wall-to-wall coverage here, but double headers, favorites in the second game of a double header, really, really important. They win at a higher rate than usual, about 62%, based on maybe the lineups being changed, or people, certain players being rested or not, or short bullpens who've been taxed the previous game. Talk about Sunday night baseball, home favorite 63%. It's your getaway day. It's your big chance under the national spotlight. So these situations as well, talk about basketball, NBA, JVT, you always, look at these back-to-back spots. Who does it benefit, or is the public even overvaluing one of these factors overall? But no matter what you're looking at, even, I like hockey, looking at rest versus tired situations, a team that's rested even off of a loss versus a team that is tired off of a win. You can look at motivation and, rested legs, and, kind of get your legs back. These can all be little things that, long story short, you want to be aware of. You don't want to cap your game in a vacuum. You want to know what happened before the game. Is there a look ahead spot? Maybe with college basketball, college football, sometimes you see that come into account. But always make sure when you're breaking down a game, when you're breaking down the matchup, figuring out who you're going to bet on, take these factors into account. Know that scheduling is baked into the cake, but you should also be aware of that when you're going into your bet, because it could provide you a big edge one way or the other.
Yeah, always just one part of the equation, right? When you had the basketball episode, Josh, I brought this up to you, that 14 teams in the NBA this season had winning records against the spread, and I'm talking about 53% ATS on the second leg of back-to-back. So it's not blindly going in a situation like that. With the scheduling spot, it's using that as part of the overall handicap.
Yeah, I think that's key, JBT. And there's also things where, you may think on the surface conventional wisdom says one thing, but maybe it could be completely different. Or maybe it's a situation where in the past it's been very profitable, or maybe there's a rule change, or the public's caught up to something, and kind of the value maybe isn't as strong as it was in previous years. So always, lean on data. Data doesn't lie, but also always be aware of these factors, because they can definitely influence a bet. And hopefully, if you do your research, it can benefit you and hopefully add a couple wins to your bankroll.
That's right. Sports Betting 101, how to make advantage bets based on on teams' schedules. If you want more details on it, you can check it out at vsin.com. It is the Everything Guide to Sports Betting here on vsin, the Sports Betting Network. All right, so baseball. Let's talk about the basics here, Josh. What do you got? America's pastime. People love baseball.
Yeah, people love baseball. Maybe not as much as they used to, but those of us who do love betting baseball, we're kind of a rare breed because baseball, it goes back such a long way. It goes all the way back into, the mid to late 1800s. It's America's pastime, as we've spoken. But specifically when it comes to betting, baseball, Major League Baseball has had a sordid, complex history in terms of betting. Remember, in 1919, the Chicago White Sox, they were referred to as the Black Sox because they took money from Arnold Rothstein. They made a movie called Eight Men Out. They threw the World Series. Shoeless Joe Jackson never got into the Hall of Fame. We love watching Field of Dreams. Also, talk about Pete Rose, the all-time hits leader, who was banned from baseball after it was found that he was betting on games. He claims it was never against his team, always for his team. But baseball has this long history with betting, and if you're a serious sports bettor, some of these rich histories, you can definitely lean on, and it kind of makes the game a little more fun and complex if you know the history. But when we're talking about baseball, the most important thing that you're looking at is the bet types. Anytime we start a new sport, you got to know the rules of the road. The first one is, what's the most common way to bet baseball? It's the money line. So this is the type of bet gets the most action, gets the most money from recreational bettors, sharp bettors. The odds are set basically with who's going to win the game in mind. Money line is just parentheses ML. ML is kind of the prefix there, but who will win the game? That's all you care about. The margin of victory doesn't matter. They could win by 100 runs, 1 run. They could win an extra innings. It doesn't matter. All you're betting on is which team will win the game. So, for example, let's say the Yankees are playing the Blue Jays. Maybe the Yankees are a minus 150 favorite. The Blue Jays are a plus 130 dog. What does that mean? That means if you want to bet on the Yankees, in order for you to win your bet, you'd have to risk $150 in order to win 100. If they win, you get your initial risk bet back as well. But also, if they lose, you lose the full 150. Whereas the Blue Jays, if they're plus 130 dog, you bet $100 on Toronto to win. They win the game, you win 130. So you always remember, favorites have that minus sign in front of them. Dogs have that plus sign. The favorite, you're laying that minus number a more expensive price because favorites win the majority of their games. So odds makers have to make it a little bit even and add some pros and cons, risk reward. Whereas dogs are going to lose most of their games, but with these plus money payouts, they're a little more profitable, little more enticing overall. After we talk about the money line, then totals. Totals are also another bet that is not as popular as the money line of baseball, but it's definitely a bet that definitely casual bettors lean on a lot of overs because they're just psychologically biased toward wanting to see home runs, runs scored, high scoring games overall. A lot of sharps can target some unders in baseball because you might have an inflated line with book shading that number to the over, knowing that the public will want to bet the over. But an average total in baseball is about 8.5. So if you wanted to bet the over in that game, both teams would have to combine to score 9 runs or more in order for you to cash your over. If you bet the under, both teams would have to score 8 runs or less overall. Then you have some other bet types. I mean, these are really your basic and your most popular ones, the money line and the total. We also have spread bets. This is the favorite minus 1.5, usually getting a better number. You'll see a lot of bettors maybe bet the Astros, who are a huge favorite, and they want to bet them on the run line, which is minus 1.5 at a better number. Your dog would be plus 1.5, so the dog could either win the game or lose by just 1 run, and you would cover that bet. You also have your first five bet, parentheses F5. That's kind of what it's referred to. It's your first half bet overall. After the first 5 innings are complete, what's the end result? You could bet the over or under. You could bet either side. But that's another profitable bet. If you look at like shadows or a good pitching matchup, you're afraid that the bullpen might blow it late. You can focus on a first five. Also, live lines. Live lines are available throughout the 9 inning game or into extra innings. They change based on the score and how the game is being played out. You can find some value on live lines. Maybe if you have a favorite, maybe the Astros are a big minus 200 favorite for the game. They're playing the Orioles. They get down 3-0 after the top of the first. You could live on the Astros, maybe get a better number for them to come back and win. And then obviously, for all sports, we have futures bets. We can look at win totals, who will win the division, the American League, National League, World Series odds, which get adjusted, throughout the season based on how each team is performing. But these are all the options available to you in baseball. The great thing with baseball, 162 game season, you have so many opportunities to maximize your edge. you really focus on the money line and totals, but all these supplementary bet types can also be beneficial to you. Knowing the rules of the road and the MLB bets that you can make huge leg up when you're deciding what kind of bet to place on whatever kind of game you want to bet on.
So that's all the ways that you can bet on baseball. You also have to have all the data to bet on baseball. With that, let's bring in Craig Edwards, Fangraphs writer at Craig J. Edwards, up on Twitter. Fangraphs, the best Major League Baseball analytical website that's out there. Craig, we appreciate some time today. So let's just start with this because, bettors need data, but of course it's certain data, right? And a lot like to look for predictive data. We don't want to go through all of the analytics that you guys offer at Fangraphs. But what are some of the major key statistics that some bettors could use that have a predictive outcome that they could they could use in their handicapping?
I mean, if you're looking for the team or individual, we've got the projections laid out for both of those. What I find most effective for me daily is taking a look at the blended projection that we have, where we look at it's basically the playoff odds, and it tells you the projected win total over the course of the season. And obviously, once we figure out how many games there will be this season, we'll get all of that adjusted. But I think that it's going to tell you the talent level for every team. And the way that we do that is we take two projection systems, Zips, which is very good, and Steamer, which is very good, and then we put in our own estimates for playing time, for how much, based on the information that we have, like how many starts a player is going to get versus how much time he's going to sit on the bench.
Craig, this is Josh Applebaum. Thanks so much for taking the time to join the show today. Always been a huge fan of Fangraphs. You guys do excellent work, and I know so many bettors who are seriously, betting baseball really lean on your data. So great job overall. But Craig, I wanted to ask you. Baseball is a very, you look at the starting pitcher in baseball, critically important, like the quarterback in football, the goalie in hockey. That one position can really make odds makers set a line at a specific number and can have a huge influence on the game. So I know we talk about ERA, earned run average. That's kind of your old school way to rate a pitcher, but what are some stat categories that you would lean on, if a new bettor is trying to cap a baseball game between two starting pitchers? Don't just look at ERA. What other stat categories would you look on to really rate how good or bad a pitcher may be?
I think walks and strikeouts are the big one. Just especially in today's game, the strikeout is incredibly important, and keeping base runners off the bases, which is what the pitcher has the most control of in terms of walk rate. And I think that those two blend together, and you add in home runs, and you can take a look at FIP, which is fielding independent pitching, and that's going to tell you a lot in terms of talent base. Now, the fielding part of the game is going to make a difference. A pitcher who maybe has a few more walks, a few less strikeouts, but has a really good defense behind him. That's going to make a difference in terms of runs. But if you're just looking from a pure talent perspective, looking at a player's FIP, which goes on the same scale as ERA. So if you want to know if somebody has a good ERA versus good FIP, it's something that should be familiar in terms of exactly how good a pitcher is.
Again, we're joined by Craig Edwards. Does a great job at Fangraphs. Great resource if you're going to bet baseball. Craig, if we flip it, we talked about betting pitchers stat categories to lean on. What if we go to hitters? Back in the day, it was really your home runs, your RBIs, and your average. That was the way baseball players were rated for decades, for over a century. But now, sabermetrics, the money ball, Billy Bean, that's really changed everything. Can you talk to maybe other stat categories that bettors should lean on when rating hitters? Maybe they want to bet a total, they want to bet an over, they want to know how often these teams get on base and score runs. I know OPS is important, but what hitter stats would you lean on, and do you provide at Fangraphs?
Yeah, if you're looking for a one-size-fits-all, what Fangraphs has is weighted runs created plus, and it takes into account everything a batter does at the plate. Everybody knows that doubles are more important than singles. Walks are almost as good as a single, and basically what it does is it takes all the outcomes that a batter might do, from the walk to the strikeout to the home run, and puts an individual weight on that, and then everything gets scaled so that 100 is perfectly average. So if you want to know if a batter is above average or below average, that 100 is that easy marker line that you can figure out. And if you're at Mike Trout level, you're up at 175. If you're the backup catcher, you might be at 75. And it sort of gives you a sense in terms of how a player is performing, and also if you're looking at projections, what their expected level of performance is. But if you want to take a step back, on base percentage, slugging percentage, those are useful tools as well. But if you want to, get all of that taken into account for, and as well as looking at the ballpark a player plays in, then weighted runs created plus is probably the easiest one-stop shop.
Craig, first five betting has become a lot more popular, mainly because, the fickle nature of bullpens. Is there anything from a statistical standpoint that you can use when you're looking at some of these bullpens and handicapping them, other than as, looking at teams in terms of as reliever, putting them through that kind of a filter or anything? Is there any other stats you can use to maybe get a hand on some of these bullpens from a handicapping perspective, as in which ones you can trust for full games and which ones you can't?
If you're looking for individual games, one thing that you might want to take a look at is our team pages and see which relief pitchers have thrown in recent days. Because if the best couple of relievers have pitched the eighth and ninth innings of the previous 2 days, they may not be pitching that day. So that's something that you might want to account for. And in terms of what is the bullpen is it's honestly just it's very tough to figure out, just because you just don't know, and particularly with the way the ball has been flying out of the ballpark the last year or so. Even when a pitcher's on, they're gonna hit some random variation there. So I mean, if you're looking past the starting rotation, I think you can look at the projections and for the talent, but I think mainly you want to look at hoping that your starter can give you 6, maybe 7 innings, so that you're not dealing with that sort of middle of the bullpen where a lot more bad things can happen.
Chris, so can you talk? You brought up FIP earlier. Can you talk about the differences between FIP and XFIP, and then tie in ERA? Because sometimes, like when I'm handicapping a baseball season, Craig, especially when we get to the middle part of it, I'll look for guys whose ERAs are either much lower or much higher than their expected fielding independent, and look like they're maybe due for some regression one way or the other. So, what's the difference between the FIP and the XFIP, and which would you think is more generally giving you an idea of how good or how poor that pitcher is and will be?
Uh, FIP is, just the inputs are essentially, walks and hit by pitches and strikeouts and homers. And what XFIP does is say, well, in 2 months time, we're not going to be able to tell what a pitcher's true talent is in terms of home runs. So it just looks at it takes what the average pitcher would give up in home runs, instead of what the pitcher has actually done. I prefer FIP because it does a little bit better of blending what has happened and what will happen in the future. Sometimes XFIP can tell you a little bit more in terms of if a FIP might be just sort of completely out of whack with the way you think that a pitcher might pitch, and that's so you might want to look at XFIP as sort of a secondary statistic to see if maybe the FIP is out of line. And I think that you're right on looking at a difference between the FIP and the ERA. There's sometimes where the defense might make that difference, but a lot of times it could just be a few ground balls got through, and it was a little bit of luck. So if a pitcher has a much lower FIP than ERA, I'm going to look at the FIP to project what the ERA is going to be in the future, more than I'm going to look at what the ERA was.
Craig, thanks so much for joining us. Only a couple questions here before we get out of here. But I just wanted to talk to you when you're doing your projections. I think a lot of maybe new bettors will focus on head to heads, like a specific batter against a specific pitcher. Maybe the pitcher owns the batter owns the pitcher. Do you take into account, or how much of that is kind of myth or real? If a guy does well off a certain pitcher, do you increase his ratings that day? Does that make you like that team more overall? And then in terms of ballparks, like, Tropicana Field and a dome is much different from Coors Field. How can the ballpark itself, maybe the weather, maybe the configuration of the park, make you kind of increase or decrease the rating of a hitter?
Yeah, I think in terms of ballpark, there's going to be more runs in Colorado than there are in San Francisco, and that's something that you want to take into account. In terms of batter versus pitcher individually, that's not something that I would pay attention to, because generally, in order to get a big enough sample size, you might be dealing with something that happened 4 or 5 years ago, and that's not really as relevant to you today. And I think that you want to look at, maybe you can maybe look at, how a batter hits against, fastball pitchers, how a batter does against righty lefty, and I think that's probably much better in terms of trying to project what's going to happen on any given day than an individual pitcher versus batter matchup.
Craig Edwards, Fangraphs.com. Craig, we appreciate some time today. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Got it. Again,
Thank you, Craig.
Fangraphs.com. If you're handicapping Major League Baseball, especially, Josh, the way at least I handicap it, when it comes to these starting pitchers and betting first fives, which is what I like to do in baseball, Fangraphs is absolutely phenomenal, and the data is almost endless at this point.
Yeah, I think that's key, and it was such a pleasure to have Craig on because, if you want to be a successful sports bettor, no matter what the sport is, you got to lean on data. And data, if you're a data-driven person, baseball can really be one of your favorite sports overall because it's a numbers game. There are so many different statistical categories. You have the old school, you have the new school numbers. If you can lean on these, if you can kind of learn to figure out, okay, which ones are more meaningful than others, then that can really help your capping overall. And then, we're going to talk later in the show, adding that into line movement. If you can kind of predict or see value on a team based on some stat categories, plus you can pick off a line before it starts to move, or maybe a dog's plus 30, you expect some sharp action, they come down to plus 120, plus 115. That can be a huge benefit overall. So it's not just identifying a good matchup, a smart bet, but also reading the market, trying to beat the market, trying to beat the closing line. You can kind of combine both the stats with the market movement and really kind of marry the two, and really over the course of a long season, really build your bankroll overall.
We should also know, too, if you go to Fangraphs, any of the stats that you're not sure what they are, how they're used, there's a giant glossary for you to use. You can get definitions, how they're used, and they even give you league averages on everything. So, all right, Fangraphs.com, you can check that out. This is the Everything Guide to Sports Betting. It's baseball today. When we roll on, the Bankroll Builder is here when we come back. Welcome back in. It's the Everything Guide to Sports Betting here on VSiN, the Sports Betting Network. I'm Jonathan Von Tobel, filling in for Patrick Maher, Josh Applebaum. Alongside, as always, it is time for our bankroll builder here on the Everything Guide to Sports Betting. Ways we can build up this bankroll, Josh, and today, of course, is baseball. So take it away. How can we build this bad boy up?
Yeah, so I think anytime you're betting a new sport, JVT, you want to focus on maybe factors that get overlooked a little bit because they can provide you a big edge. And I always look at, when I'm trying to place a smart bet, I'm thinking like a lawyer. I'm building a case. I'm trying to check off as many boxes as possible to make the smartest bet that I can make. So just a couple that bettors should, think about. You don't want this to be the only reason you bet a game, but it's a good cherry on top if you can kind of have all your data line up one way. Plus, you get one of these factors in your favor as well. So the first one is weather. Baseball is a big weather, sport. Weather can have a big effect on the game overall. Obviously, when you're talking about an indoor sport, doesn't matter at all. But really, football, especially baseball, weather and especially wind can have a big impact on the game overall. And really, when you're betting totals, it can have the biggest impact. So we're talking about weather. We're looking at forecasts. You don't want to look too early because it could be off and maybe the weather changes a little bit later, closer to game time. But generally speaking, a good rule of thumb is when the wind is blowing out, that always benefits an over. Why is that important? Because when you think about it, when the wind is blowing out, and you always think of Wrigley Field in Chicago, you look at the flags in center, they're whipping one direction or the other. But think of it this way: hitter hits a deep fly ball on a regular day with no wind, it would be a warning track out. It would be an out. It would be caught by the outfielder on the warning track. But if the wind's picking up, the wind swirling, the ball gets picked up by the wind, it can be pushed into the stands. It can become a home run. Why is that important? Because that can turn outs into runs. It can benefit overs. The flip side, though, the wind can be blowing in. That can really benefit unders. Same thing where, a deep fly ball, maybe it's a first row homer, it gets knocked down, becomes a warning track out. So these little things are really important. To me, I'm looking at sustained wins throughout the game. I'm looking at wins that are ideally, 5 mile per hour or less. That's not going to make a big difference. It's really 10 miles an hour or more where you really start to pick up on these things. But also, aside from the wind, we look at heat and humidity. That can also help overs. When it's really hot out, the pitcher's, really sweating there on the mound. The batters can be in the dugout with a fan on them. Really benefits the hitters, but the real reason is when it's hot, the air is less dense, so the ball can travel further than when it's a cooler day overall. But also, the lack of weather can be important too, because if a game is played in a dome like Tropicana Field or a closed roof stadium, this is why you gotta do your homework and figure out, okay, what kind of stadium is it, but also will the roof be closed or not. The stadiums will announce this usually a few hours before the game, or maybe earlier in the day. But when you're a dome or closed roof stadium, really benefits an under because of their ideal conditions for a pitcher. The ball really doesn't travel. Perfect conditions for the fielder as well. So these little things are really important. And then next up, JBT, we're going to talk a little umpires, but weather, your first important factor overall.
Yep, and by the way, too, to your point about the stadiums, look no further than the Japan series to open the year last year. Remember, because that was a bomb fest between the A's and the Mariners, and then the London series between the Red Sox and the Yankees, which was an absolute offensive slugfest between those two teams. And the stadiums made a big reason, or were a big reason behind that. So, get into the umpires then, Josh, too, as well.
Yeah, umps are really important because the home plate ump can have a big influence on the game overall. You got to remember, in the end, they're human, and home plate umpires, they have tendencies overall where they may have a big strike zone, they may have a small strike zone. A big strike zone can really benefit the pitcher. You have more strikeouts, small strike zone overall, maybe more walks, more base runners, really important. Again, not the only reason you bet a game, but you want to know this going into it because you want to try to exploit these tendencies overall. Always look at Joe West. Joe West is a perfect example because when you look at Joe West, dogs win at a 47% clip when Joe West is behind the plate since 2003, according to BetLab Sports. All dogs in general only win at a 42.5% clip. So dogs are winning at almost a 5% higher clip with Joe West behind the plate compared to other umpires overall. You can also look at umps that maybe try to stick it to the home team, try to appear impartial. That can be another thing you want to look at overall. But another good tip is, check the box scores. Whoever is the first base ump on tonight's game will be the home plate ump on the next game. So you can kind of always predict, look at, again, different tendencies overall. But one warning is, again, you're not going to bet a dog only because Joe West is the umpire. But if you like that dog anyway, plus you have Joe West, that's the sort of thing you want to layer on more advantages to your bet overall. But again, be aware of these home plate umps. They can have an effect that can increase or decrease your chances of winning a bet.
A lot of people ask, Josh, where do you find umpires in terms of that day's games? Where's a good spot to look in terms of data for that?
Yeah, you can go to box scores. You can go to MLB.com. There's different ump sites overall. But yeah, this data is pretty widely available. And again, another box you want to check off when you're trying to bet a game.
All right. Andy Iskoe, professional bettor, is going to join us at the bottom of the hour. We'll go over his thoughts as a baseball handicapper. We get into market factors next here on the Everything Guide to Sports Betting. Men, start taking notes because Manscaped action is finally a thing of the past. No more cuts and nicks with the Manscaped Lawnmower 3.0. It's their third-generation trimmer featuring advanced skin-safe technology so you can keep your bad boys nice and smooth. The Manscaped engineering team spent 18 months perfecting the greatest hair trimmer ever created, and they just released the new and improved Lawnmower 3.0. Battery's going to last up to 90 minutes. You could take longer, getting every crack and crevice. One of the coolest features, the LED light, which illuminates grooming areas for a closer, more precise trimming. 20% off and free shipping. Code VSIN, manscaped.com. That's 20% off and free shipping at manscaped.com. Use the code VSIN. It's the Everything Guide to Sports Betting here on VSIN, the Sports Betting Network. I'm Jonathan Von Tobel, Josh Applebaum alongside as well. It is time for Market Factors. All right, Josh, first up, Major League Baseball underdogs. You've alluded to a couple of the numbers behind them here, but what's the value with MLB underdogs?
Yeah, so JVT, kind of knowing the rules of the road is important when you're betting baseball because it's unlike any other sport, just in terms of the volume of games, different factors going into it overall. But one thing to remember with baseball is that, the public is going to be really prominently betting a lot of favorites. They want to bet on big name teams, the Red Sox, the Yankees, the Dodgers, the Cubs. However, underdogs have a lot of value in baseball for a couple different reasons here overall. Number one, when you're talking about spread sports, where you're prominently betting, spread over unders, you're usually laying the juice here on both. If you look at minus 110 standard juice with your spread and total sports, you have to win 52.3% of the time in order to break even. However, when you're talking baseball, if you bet on a lot of favorites, you're going to have to win at a much higher rate, 54, 55, 56% if you're laying these big numbers, the minus 150s or more. On the flip side, if you can try to avoid the big favorites and focus on a lot of underdogs, which give you plus money, think of dogs in the plus 120, plus 150, plus 175 range or more, you can actually win at a lower rate, but still turn a decent profit overall. So, if I told you, JVT, you can win less than 50% of your bets, but still make money, you'd kind of scratch your head and say, how is that possible? But in baseball, if you can identify a lot of, sharp dogs, and these dogs can win only 40, even like 45, 46, 47% of the bets, if they can win at that rate, you can still make money because you're only losing the one unit that you risk when you lose, but when you're winning, you're getting these additional payouts overall. Now, that being said, you can't just focus on every single dog because we know that, favorites are going to win the majority of their games. However, one thing to keep in mind for new bettors betting baseball, look at divisional dogs. That's really, really important. Divisional dogs, teams in the same division, when they play each other, that dog performs much better overall versus a dog in a non-divisional game. And that's all about the built-in familiarity. When you're in the same division, the AL East, the NL West, whatever it may be, there's a lot of familiarity. You play each other 19 times a year. You know the opponent. You know the pitching matchup. You know the stadium. You know coaching tendencies. There's so much familiarity that it really benefits the dog. It levels the playing field. So that divisional dog will perform much better than a non-divisional underdog, where really the lack of familiarity benefits the favorite. But also looking at totals and correlative betting. When you're looking at a dog, you really want a higher end total because higher end total used to be around 8.5. Now, kind of juice ball era, maybe it's more 9.5 even. A higher total when you're betting a dog is a good thing because the more expected runs scored basically leads to more variance and bigger upset opportunities. Whereas if you're betting a favorite, a lower total is a better thing. A 7.5 total or less, because the books are expecting fewer runs scored, and kind of just game theory, it's more likely going to come from the better team overall. So remember, baseball betting underdogs have a lot of value. You can win less than 50% of your dog bets, but still make money with the plus money payouts. Focus on divisional dogs, and then focus on dogs with high totals. Those are some basics there. But JVT, I know you have some really good information on buy low, sell high opportunities, specifically when it comes to pitchers. Can you let us know about that a little?
Yeah, so we started doing this last year on The Edge, and the inspiration came from Jeff Vogel, who writes our newsletter all the time. And we alluded to a little bit when we were talking earlier, we were talking with Craig about everything at Fangraphs. And so, Josh, what I'll do is I like to look for pitchers, and this is a lot of it is in season, right? But you look for a pitcher whose ERA is, to me, vastly different than their xFIP. I use their xFIP. And so if you see some of the numbers here, these are season-long numbers. And so my thought process going into the year is these are going to be some guys where you might get some high prices on that you either want to avoid or maybe come back and get the other side on an inflated dog price. Let's start with Zach Gallen, right? Arizona Diamondbacks came over in the middle of the season, young pitcher, really high ceiling, actually a lot in terms of narrative behind him as well. But you look at it's labeled as the delta, but the difference between the ERA and the xFIP, his ERA was 1.34 lower than his actual xFIP. So to me, there's some negative regression coming, and you can't just look at that, right, as the only thing and go, okay, I'm going to go against Zach Gallen. To me, you have to look at other statistical reasonings behind it, right? A piece of the, one of the ingredients in the cake that you're making, as you talk about all the time. So then you look a little bit more. You realize his walks per 9 are pretty high. He walks 4 guys every 9 innings. His walk rate's over 10%, which is below average. And his hard hit rate, which is meaning giving up hard contact to opposing hitters, is at 39.9%. That's a really poor rate. You don't want anywhere near about 36 to 35 is my barometer. That's below average for a pitcher to give up hard contact. So all of that in consideration, Josh, He comes in this season off of a really solid year, an ERA that was probably lower than it should have been. I think you're going to get some inflated prices on Zach Gallen, so I'm either, one, going to stay away from some of the games, or if the matchup is good enough with the pitcher that he's opposing early on, I'm going to probably play against him. It's the same thing with a guy like John Means. I know Sean Newcomb's up there, but John Means also has kind of a narrative behind him. One of the better young pitchers for a bad baseball team last year in Baltimore. The difference between his ERA and his xFIP, his ERA was 1.88 lower than his xFIP. That's a massive difference. So you look at it. The batting average on balls in play was 256. League average is about 300. So either really good defense, the ball was bouncing perfectly for him. 256 is below average, which means you may be getting a smidge lucky. You look at the ground ball to fly ball ratio. He's clearly a fly ball pitcher, and on top of that, he's not getting guys to induce swing and misses at 9.9. That's a little bit below league average, and his strikeout per nine are 7.03. So I have a fly ball pitcher whose delta is 1.88, who's actually giving up a decent amount of hard contact and not getting guys to swing and miss. To me, that's the profile of a guy that I want to sell high on and go against him once baseball season starts.
Yeah, JBT, I think that's a great way to look at some bets. You can also look at just as a bettor, you always regress to the mean. When you're
Right.
doing great and you're winning a ton of your bets, you're never as good as when you're hitting 60%. Also, when you're in a cold streak and you're winning 4 out of 10 bets, you're never as bad as that overall. So I think kind of the moral of the story here with these baseball pitchers, which you hit the nail on the head, is are they getting lucky or unlucky? If they're really lucky and that they have a great ERA, you got to remember the public will see that 1.3 ERA. That'll make them want to bet on that pitcher, but maybe that's not their historical average overall. So I think that's really important. And then lastly, remember that baseball, it's a mental game. It's a long season. There are a lot of ups and downs. You got to have thick skin, and you got to know that with over 2,400 games to be played overall, it's okay to lay off and just know that tracking your plays is important to learn about who you are as a bettor.
That's right. And speaking of bettors, Andy Iskoe is going to join us when we return. We're going to talk about his perspective, how he handicaps this, action versus listed, much more, as we barely scratched the surface on baseball betting here on the Everything Guide to Sports Betting on VSiN. It's the Everything Guide to Sports Betting here on VSiN, the Sports Betting Network. Hit up VSiN.com, by the way. VSiN Plus subs free until a major sport returns. All right, let's head out. Andy Iskoe, professional bettor with us at VegasAndy711 up on Twitter. Josh Applebaum always alongside. It's his gig anyway. All right, Andy, let's start with this because there's a lot to get to when it comes to betting on baseball and so many ins and outs with statistics. I'll just start with a general question, and I think I know the answer, but where do you start when you're handicapping a baseball game? Is it pitchers? Is it lineups? Is it umpires? Where do you begin your handicapping process when it comes to a game-to-game basis?
Well, I actually begin now. Obviously, the game has changed over the past 30, 40 years. Starting pitching is not nearly as important as it was back in the day when complete games were the norm rather than the rare exception. But it still comprises a significant part of the handicap because when you look at it, batters are going to have batters on average, let's say they're going to have 4 attempts per game to make an impact on offense. Pitchers are going to have 25 to 30 or more attempts per game at preventing action from batters. So starting pitching still has a major impact on the game, and as such, it's the starting part for my handicapping. But as part of the entire equation, it's a considerably lower percentage of the handicapping exercise than it has been in the past.
Taking the time to join us today on the Everything Guide to Sports Betting. I wanted to ask you, what are some tips you would, give to new bettors trying to bet baseball? I think, I tried to allude to it in the last segment that baseball is unlike any other season. There's 2,400 games overall. If you're the type of guy who bets too many games, baseball can be dangerous because, you got 15 games a day. And if you have too much action and really you're not betting with an edge, you can really, limit your bankroll and lose your whole bankroll. How do you, how important is discipline betting baseball? And how are you able to maybe, okay, there's 5 games I'm monitoring today, but I'm really only going to cut them down and bet 2. What's your selection process overall?
Well, the first part that you mentioned talks about the way baseball is bet, and that involves the money line as opposed to the point spread. So you could be taking plus $1.40 on one game, and you might be laying $2.20 on the next game. And so baseball's been long known as a grinded-out sport with a very low overall rate of return, but that rate of return is based upon a high volume. So the bottom line, the dollars ultimately that you win will be a fairly substantial amount if you handicap and bet properly. As far as the methods that I use or the way that I explain people, it's changed over the years. Back in the day, you used to have side and total. Now you've got, and I'm going to set aside in-play wagering for the moment, but you've got basically the equivalent of halftime wagering, which involves the first 5 innings in a baseball game. I mentioned before about the diminishing importance of starting pitching, but that goes for the full 9 innings. Most starting pitchers will still go 4, 5, or 6 innings, basically meaning that if you play the first 5 innings in a game, you take out to a large extent the impact of the quite variable and often random events that occur with bullpen. So I'll look for situations, for example, on a card where I've got 2 good pitchers facing one another. I'll look under initially in those games. 2 bad starting pitchers facing one another. I'll look over for the first 5 innings in that game. And often when I take a look at the day's card of 15 games, there might be 7 or 8 games that I will almost eliminate initially because there's too much uncertainty according to the variables and the factors that I use. So I'll concentrate on the other 7 or 8, often narrow them down to maybe 3 or 4, but some days I might pass entirely. Some days there might be 6 games depending upon how the matchups fall out.
Andy, I think that's some great information as well. And I wanted to ask you because I think one thing that a lot of new bettors overlook overall is the action versus listed pitcher. I think this is something that you got to be aware of. New bettors don't even know what it means or how important it is. You know, it's basically when a pitcher gets scratched, pushed back, traded, whatever it may be, and then your odds can be adjusted based on the new pitchers overall. But what would be your take? You know, I'm of the opinion that, you know, really listed pitcher is the way to go. But are you a listed pitcher fan? You know, do you ever isolate just one listed pitcher instead of both? What's your take on action versus listed pitcher?
I have always been an advocate of listing both pitchers in the game because, again, both starting pitchers provide a significant portion of the handicap. So if I'm going to go and make a wager, I want to know that I'm getting at least as I mentioned, despite their diminished overall impact, they're still the most significant impact involved in games. There will be situations where I'm looking to bet against a certain pitcher, and I will list that either action over pitcher or pitcher over action, depending upon which side I'm going. Or I will sometimes just play action versus action. But I would say if that's even 5% of the overall play, that's overstating the amount. It's extremely rare for me not to list both starting pitching because, again, that's the basis. That's the most significant factor, the highest weighted factor of the handicap, though, again, diminished from years past.
Andy, you talked about the value of starting pitchers and maybe a little diminished when it comes to the full games. The last, I'd say, 2 years, I've been more of a first 5 better than ever before. One, how much do you use first 5? And 2, when you're looking at that, because I just use it as, like, I can't trust these bullpens. And so that's my second part of the question is how do you factor in the bullpen when you're talking about looking at these from a full game perspective?
No, that's exactly what I was alluding to a bit earlier, that the first 5 innings presents a lot more of the opportunities because basically, except in unusual situations, you're going to get both starting pitchers going 5 innings before the bullpens get involved. So there's a little bit less randomness. There's a little bit less uncertainty as far as the handicap goes. Now, most of the time, and I'd say let me also mention that as far as first 5 innings go, the vast majority of my plays will be on totals rather than on either side. If I'm looking for a big advantage from either side, I might still look to the full game, and if there's a huge edge that I see, I might look at the run line. Now, obviously, that'll mean that I'm taking or I'm including bullpens into the equation. But for first 5 innings, I would say probably 95%, maybe even more of my first 5 innings will be on totals, either the over or the under. Obviously, those numbers are lower, anywhere in general from 3.5 to 4.5. But again, depending upon the quality of those starting pitching, I'd rather go with just the first 5 innings, and as you just mentioned, take the bullpens out of the equation.
So before we get you out of here, Andy, what are some of the statistics that you use? What stats hold the most weight with you when you're handicapping baseball, both pitcher and lineup?
Well, with lineup, and we live in an age right now where there's much more information than ever before. So you like to take a look at the projected starting lineup, and then if there's time when the lineup comes out to confirm it, how those batters do the first time against specific starting pitchers who they'll be facing that day and starting pitchers in general. What's the variation between how they perform the first time they see a pitcher in a game, the second time, and perhaps even the third time? Likewise, I'll take a look at the starting pitcher and see how he fares against the opposing lineup in specifics and in lineups in general the first, second, and third times through the lineup to find if there are any aberrations where usually you'll get a little bit more effectiveness the more that you see a batter, or conversely for certain batters against pitchers. If there are any variations where, for example, guys are unusually weak in the first time through a lineup, either batter or pitcher, I want to be aware of that. I also take a look at current form of pitchers. I generally like to rely on the last 3 starts, which will comprise about a 10 day to 2 week period to get an idea of how well the pitcher has been performing. And then again, you do also need to keep, even though you base a lot of the handicap on the starting pitching, you do want to consider the strength of the bullpen, the use of the bullpen, who's available, who's not available, likely, just in case, A, you're considering a play on the full game as opposed to the first 5 innings, or if the first 5 innings don't develop the way you expect it to and the starter is pulled unusually early.
Andy Iskoe, you can follow him up on Twitter, of course, at Vegas Andy 711. Andy, always good to talk to you, man. Thank you very much for the time.
Guys, you're providing a great deal of enjoyment during this hiatus, and hopefully we'll be back to action pretty soon.
Appreciate it, Andy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy.
Andy Iskoe. All right, Josh, it is that time. Throw up the journal. What do we got today?
Yeah, so, Josh's journal today, what do we talk about? We talked baseball, and really the important thing when you're getting into it, knowing the basics, knowing that what are your most important bet types, your most popular bet types, the money line. You're betting on which team will just win the game straight up. The favorite is laying a minus number. The dog is getting a plus money payout. Also talked about totals. Totals are kind of your second most important bet. You're looking at combined runs for both teams. If the total's 8.5, you bet the over. You need 9 runs or more. You bet the under. You need 8 runs or less. Goes into extra innings. That all counts. Also looking at how to use data. Data is really important. We talked to Craig Edwards of Fangraphs, and that's a great resource if you're learning to bet on baseball. And again, baseball is a great sport if you're a numbers type guy or girl, because there's so many different stat categories, advanced analytics, and if you can really isolate some like OPS or looking at different ratios for pitching talent, the VIP, that's all important. We talked JVT, you were talking about regression where a pitcher's way over his head in terms of his ERA, and he's going to regress to the mean. So you're only as good as the data that you have. I also talked about the public. The public can have an influence on baseball. You'll oftentimes see a lot of these big favorite teams, the Yankees, the Red Sox, kind of be juiced up or laying a big number overall, and as a result, a lot of dogs have value in baseball, because unlike a spread sport where you got to win 52.38% of your bets, assuming standard minus 110 juice to break even, you can win less than 50% of bets if you're focusing on plus money payout dogs overall. And remember, divisional dogs bark loudest. Also, dogs with a high total we love to lean on. JVT, you were talking buy low, sell high, looking at regression type opportunities. We talked to Andy Iskoe, professional bettor. I think what Andy hit on, which was important, is looking at that first 5 bet. That's really kind of become the new, the wise guy, under the radar sharp bet overall. And then I would just add in, at the end, just remember, baseball is a long, long season. There are ups and downs. You can have a terrible April and then a great May. You never want to get down on yourself. You want to try to limit your plays. You also want to make sure when you're betting baseball, you have multiple outs. You have access to, 4, 5, 6 or more different sports books, because when you're betting the money line and when you're betting the total, a half run, laying a minus 120 instead of a minus 130, that's so critical, because when you expound that over the course of a really long season, that can really increase your wins and decrease your losses. So as always, shop for the best line, get the best number, JBT.
Yep, and I should note too, of course, that buy low, sell high we were talking about, Josh. I'm exclusively the first 5 handicapper when it comes to that. Takes bullpens out of the equation, just handicap the pitchers and move on from there. Josh Applebaum, of course, it is the Everything Guide to Sports Betting. Josh, always good to be on with you. Check out everything available up at vsin.com. Josh has write-ups all the time there and in Point Spread Weekly, so check out vsin.com/subscribe as well. Sign up for everything that we offer here at the Vegas Stats and Information Network. And with that, we'll see you next time.